Hello, this is Ben Selvin, sitting beside Bruce Lundvall in the new CBS building on July the 29th, 1965. Bruce has asked me to do a little reminiscing about some of the olden days in the recording field, of course, particularly that portion of my recording career that had to do with Columbia. So they tell me that names make the news, so let's throw out a few names for what they're worth. Perhaps you'll find some value in some of the stories for posterity. The artists with whom we have worked during the old Columbia days were great to work with, some more or less. When asked on a recent radio program with which artist did I have the greatest amount of pleasure of working, they're greatly surprised when I say Ethel Waters. And the reason for my saying Ethel Waters is because in booking musicians for various house dates, when we accompanied so many of the singers, the Meltons and the Ruth Eddings and the Kate Smiths and all the others, I would have to make many calls in order to get the right combination of musicians that I needed. And sometimes when I would call certain musicians like Tommy Dorsey and Benny Goodman and Jimmy, Manny Klein, Joe Venuti, and Eddie Lang, in some instances they were busy elsewhere, and all I had to say was, fellas, this is for Ethel Waters. And, you know, they would cancel whatever sessions they had in order to work with Ethel Waters. I don't know of a greater tribute to an artist than that, far removed than other names which we'll tell you about later on during my stay with Columbia in Hollywood. Ruth Edding was a delightful person to work with, except when her husband, Colonel Gimp, was around, and he really ran the show. I remember one time he got into a very serious argument with the man with whom I was working, Eddie King, who was really in charge of the pop division at A&R, and he refused absolutely to do any more recording as long as Eddie King was in the studio. And he asked Henry Cox, who was our president at the time, to put me in charge of all of our sessions, which they did, much to the chagrin of Eddie King. And as a matter of fact, this was one of the reasons why Eddie King actually left Columbia Records during the early days of 1929 and devoted all of his time in Wall Street, and incidentally wound up almost in the poorhouse. But Ethel Waters and Ruth Edding were two of my favorites. I remember a very interesting story about Rudy Valley. Rudy Valley used to play the saxophone, and he worked in England. And while he was there, he played a tune that I had a little something to do with writing called Love is Just a Gamble. And it wasn't a very good tune, never became a hit, but he seemed to like it. So when he came to New York, he looked me up. I was then at Columbia, I think it was 1927 or 28, and introduced himself and said that he liked the tune and could I give him another copy of it. But I think the real reason for him coming to see me was that he was looking for a recording session, and believe it or not, he got one, because soon after that he was on a little local program on WMCA, so we gave him his first chance to record, but on the Harmony label and not on the Victor label. And it wasn't until a couple of years later, when he had made a hit, that we switched him over from Harmony to Columbia. During that time, we recorded a tune of his called Hallelujah, I'm a Bum. It was an Al Jolson picture. And at that time, we were doing a lot of exchanging of masters with the English Columbia. And when we sent this particular master over there, Rudy was already becoming quite popular. They said they'd like very much to use this master, but they couldn't use it because of the word bum, which is a very naughty word in England, if you know. And if you don't, write to me personally, and I'll tell you what it means. And they said, would we give them the privilege of re-recording that? And remember, this is in the days of wax and not tape. And they would like to substitute the word tramp for the word bum. And, of course, we agreed to have them do this if they were able to. So they re-recorded the record, and every time the word bum appeared, it was a blank. They cut off the sound, and then they got somebody to sound as close to Rudy as possible, and inserted the word tramp. So when we got the English recording of this thing, it says, Hallelujah, I'm a tramp, and so forth. And it did quite well. But this, I think, was the first time that I realized what can be done with a little bit of editing. Of course, if we had tape in those days, it would have been a lot easier. An interesting anecdote that I seem to remember in connection with Lombardo. When we supervised the Lombardo sessions, uh, once in a while, Guy would bring, well, he always would bring his violin with him, but rarely would he ever use it. But this one particular time, his arranger had written in a few measures of a violin solo. I'm not sure whether the title was Crying for the Carolines or Caroline in the Morning. Your people here can check this. But it was one of the Caroline tunes, and when I heard him play those few measures, it sounded so bad I couldn't possibly take it. So I walked over to Guy and whispered in his ear. I said, Guy, look, no one will know the difference. This is just among us boys here. If you don't mind, I'd be very happy to play those few measures for you. And he said, well, that would be wonderful. He was very grateful, and I played the few measures for him. I was still in practice. And the record came out pretty good. Well, he went on the road after the record was released, and his public demanded that he play this tune, and he couldn't deliver. And he said, never again. Thank you for small favors, but this was one time that it boomeranged on him. The Crosby story is quite interesting. When he was a member of the Whiteman Orchestra, the management then decided that they would give him a crack at doing a solo. But we weren't quite sure whether he was going to make it or not. It was an experiment, pure and simple. So they gave me a big four-piece orchestra with which to work. And in the second chorus, of course, it's pretty difficult to do much with a four-piece band, and it was suggested that Bing, why don't you whistle the second chorus? And it's become more or less one of Bing's trademarks. You might be interested to know who some of the A&R boys were in those days. I'm talking now about a period between 1927 and perhaps 1933 or 34. We had Tommy Rockwell, who later became his personal manager of Crosby, the Rockwell O'Keefe Agency, who has passed on. And we had Ted Collins, who was manager of the Velvetone label. Frank Walker was head of the Harmony label, and Eddie King and I handled the Columbia label. The names under which we worked during those Columbia days. Oh, let me say this, that I started to record for Columbia as an artist about 1923. But at that time, I was under contract to Brunswick and was unable to use the Ben Selvin name on any other label. But we had loved recording so well that I devoted nearly all of my time to it, and we were actually working for 9 different labels at the same time under 9 different names. And the names that I used for the Columbia label were the Cavaliers, who did the waltzes, and the Knickerbockers, who did the foxtrots. Not only foxtrots, but they had to tie in with musical comedy tunes because they felt the Knickerbockers was something of a name for New York. And then in 27, while I was working in the Frivolity Club, which is now called Birdland, I received a couple of visitors. Mr. Harry Cox, who was president of Columbia Records, and Frank Walker, who was one of the managers, came in to this nightclub, and I was amazed to see them there because neither one of them were habitués of nightclubs. They were both very clean-living, non-drinking men. And I had just returned from Europe, where I spent my first real vacation, and felt really down in the mouth for having to play in a miserable nightclub for a bunch of pimps and whores and what have you. And I was in terrible frame of mind when they walked in. So while I was sitting there having Coke, I happened to mention the fact that I was fed up with nightclub work, and if ever there was an opportunity for myself to fit into their organization, that I would very much like to be considered. And they said, well, this is the main reason we're here. We know a little bit about your business ability and your musical ability, and we'd like to know whether you'd be interested in joining our organization. Of course, I was delighted. The next morning, I went into the Columbia office at 1819 Broadway and walked out with a 2-year contract doing 3 jobs, because one of the jobs was to be sort of a liaison between Columbia Records and a brand new broadcasting company which they were forming called Columbia Broadcasting System. And a part of my job was to put on a Columbia Phonograph Hour radio show, which was the big show of the week between 9 and 10 on Wednesdays, and was broadcast over 10 stations. This was the whole caboodle of CBS at that time. It consisted of 10 radio stations, with WOR being the key station, WCAU in Philadelphia and WGN in Chicago. Anyway, the Columbia Broadcasting System consisted of 21 hours a week, 3 hours a night, from 7 to 10, 7 days a week. So part of my job was to look after the house orchestras there. Howard Barlow was the conductor of the symphony orchestra, and Don Voorhees was the conductor of the pop orchestra. And I would put on these radio shows every Wednesday night. In addition to that, I was made musical director for the Harmony label, and there I would accompany Kate Smith, who was at that time a harmony artist, and Rudy Valley, and many others. And the second part of my job was to, that was the second part. The first job was the producer, second job was the musical director, and the third job was to keep recording with my own orchestra under various names, and I was given a flat fee for that purpose, and I don't know how many, 24 or 36 sides a year. Well, I enjoyed the work immensely, to say the least, because it put me in contact with a lot of wonderful people. I worked in 28. Management decided that broadcasting was not very profitable, and it was during that time when one of our few sponsors was the La Paulina Cigar Company. And this is where I met Mr. Paley, who was the advertising manager for La Paulina. And the end result was that we sold the Columbia Broadcasting System to Mr. Paley's crowd for, well, just a few $1,000s. And I was without a part of my job, a big part of my job. So it was at that time when we sold the broadcasting system that they gave me more responsibilities at Columbia, and I became an A&R man with a lot more to do on the Columbia label. It was then that we did the Two Black Crows and so many wonderful, wonderful things. Ted Lewis was one of the artists with whom we had to work, supervise some of his recordings, and he had a very expensive contract and wasn't doing too well there for quite a while. Styles were changing, and he wasn't changing with them, and we were desperate for something to do, so I went to Ted and suggested that perhaps we could put him back on the hit list if he would agree to having us make a couple of changes in the orchestra that no one was going to know about, because only those in the studio would be aware of it, and said, why don't you let me put Jimmy Dorsey in your orchestra as a clarinet player, and let me put Fats Waller in as pianist, and I think this will give you the necessary jab that you needed. Well, he agreed, and we made a few great records with Fats and Jimmy, and soon after that, Ted Lewis had an offer to work at the Les Ambassadeurs in Paris, but they wanted the orchestra that were on records, and Ted was forced to pay through the nose in order to get Jimmy Dorsey's services, because Jimmy was doing very well as houseman with so many of the recording orchestras, and he couldn't get Fats Waller to go with him, but he did take Jimmy Dorsey to Paris with him for 6 or 8 weeks, and only because of the fact that they wanted to hear what was on these Columbia records. Well, there's much to talk about. We've had some great experiences, of course, when we worked for Columbia in Hollywood. And if I didn't get ulcers then, I don't think I ever will. Manny Sachs sent me out there to replace Joe Higgins. And with explicit instructions by both Manny and Ted Wallerstein, go out there and get tough. Let them know who's running this show, because we're having difficulty with some of those artists. Well, if you know these artists, this was quite a responsibility. I tried, but must admit that I didn't do too well, because by that time they were pretty badly spoiled. I remember when Goddard Lieberson called me one day, who was then in charge of the Masterworks, and wanted to know if I would be agreeable to supervising a Nelson Eddy session, because this was Masterworks and I was in the pop field. And I said I'd be very happy to, and I thought I could handle it, and this would preclude his need for sending a man to Hollywood. So he called Nelson Eddy and told Nelson that I was going to be in charge, And I called Nelson on the phone, whom I'd never met him up till that time, and made all the arrangements to record him at the Lux Playhouse. Well, for one reason or another, Nelson didn't get to the studio on time because he claimed that he was told to go to a different studio and not to Lux Playhouse. But I proved him to be wrong because he was the one who hired his own conductor and his own chorus, and he told them where to be, so that, needless to say, it was his fault and not ours. But when he got to the studio about 20 minutes late, he was so upset over the fact that he was late, and he claimed for the first time in his life, that he lost his voice and couldn't sing, and that was that. And, of course, I was in a terrible sweat because this was a great responsibility. So I asked him, would he come on stage and go through the motions, and that we would do the track. And when he felt better, he could come back and do the voice. He didn't realize that we could do that in those days. He thought only the movies were able to use this technique. So he came on stage and went through the motions, and after 20 minutes or so, he was a little more relaxed, and he said that perhaps he could do it live, and I said I would appreciate it if we could do it simultaneously. When he looked at the microphone that we were going to use for his voice, he absolutely refused to work. He says that he had tried this microphone at NBC, and it stunk. He said he can't use it, it's no good. And I said, I'm terribly sorry, but our instructions from New York Engineering was that we were to use this new microphone from now on all sessions, and that if Mr. Eddie wasn't going to use it, I had to tell him that he would have to be responsible for any remakes. And, of course, he got all excited again and started screaming and refused to do it. So we said, all right, we'll try the old mic, but I refuse to take the responsibility. He tried a few measures of it, and he sang very badly. He was on edge, and the voice wasn't good, and it was just terrible. And here I had a 30-piece orchestra and a large chorus, and I said, well, I've got to do something about this. So I asked him to do me a special favor. Now, up to this time, I've been quarreling with him, so that he was quite pleased to have me ask for a favor. And I said, try the new microphone for 8 measures, and if you don't like the results of it, I'll pay for the remake. He couldn't refuse this very reasonable request. And I said, and take it easy. He was relaxed. He sang 8 bars, heard the playback. He said, Jesus Christ, where can I buy one of these? This is the greatest thing I've heard, and I want to buy one and take it with me to all my concerts. And, well, the point of the story is that this is one way of handling some of these temperamental people, but he's become one of my closest and warmest friends as a result of this experience. Another Columbia artist, whom I'm sure you all know, Oscar Levant. Again, I got a call from Goddard. Said, we have one more tune to record in order to fill an album of Debussy. Could you handle it? And I said I could and would like to. And again, I had no contact with Oscar Levant. So Goddard called Oscar and told him I was going to be in charge, and I called Mr. Levant and made the necessary arrangements to record him at the Lux Playhouse on a certain evening at 8 o'clock. The day of the recording, he calls me at my Hollywood office and said, cancel the session. Well, I'd heard about this boy's idiosyncrasies, and I said, are you ill? He said, no, I'm not ill. He said, but I'm through with Columbia, and if I'm through, why should I bother doing them any favors? And I said, I don't know the terms of your contract, but what happened? He says, didn't you read the Daily Variety today? I said, well, yes, I read it every morning. He said, doesn't it say there that I'm through with Columbia? And I said, Mr. Levant, I not only read it, but I planted the story. And the story reads that Oscar Levant's session tonight at the Lux Playhouse will be the last session to be recorded by Columbia Phonograph Company, Columbia Records. That from now on, all Columbia records was to be recorded at radio recorders, because I had been working with the New York boys and persuaded them to try radio recorders, not only because of better quality, in my opinion, but a very low cost of operation where we didn't have to pay for engineers who were going on vacations and all kinds of bonuses because we could only get the studios at night and during holidays. And New York agreed with me that it was worth trying. We made some tests at radio recorders, and it was agreed that this was to be done, and it was in effect for many, many years later, incidentally. So I said, this is your misunderstanding. You're not through, as far as I know, but yours is the last session to be recorded. Well, he didn't quite understand it. However, he said, since I read the story, I stopped practicing And I'm not in shape. I said, well, in that case, Mr. Levant, we're going to have to charge you $75 for the rental of the piano because your piano has been delivered to the playhouse. Your piano tuner is there on your instructions. Not only is the piano tuned, but he's to remain during the recording session, which you demanded. Should the piano get out of tune during the session, he'd be there to make the necessary check. So I said, we're going to have to charge you for that. Well, there was a couple of seconds of silence. And he said, well, wait a minute. He says, now, he said, let me think about it. He said, by the way, he says, you're a musician, aren't you? And I said, I was considered such. He said, would you come over to the house and hear me play this and see if you think it's good enough? Well, I realized right there and then that we had won that fight and that he was actually going to do the recording. I said, yes, I could come over. Where do you live? And he gave me this fancy address in Beverly Hills. Well, little did he know that I had even a nicer place than he did in Beverly Hills because my swimming pool was heated and his wasn't. So anyway, I drove up in his driveway in a brand new Fleetwood Cadillac that Manny was able to buy for me through his connections in Philadelphia. And I drove into the driveway, and this, of course, made an impression on this chap, as it does with most Hollywood people. I opened the door. He invited me to have some coffee, and I said, thank you. No, let me hear you play. And he started to play, and he was putting on a show for me, I'm sure. Frankly, I don't ever remember hearing as marvelous a performance as he put on for me that afternoon in his home. And I said, Mr. Levant, if we can capture this performance, we will have one of the finest records ever made. He said, you mean if we can record it right now? I said, this is possible. I called the studio, and the gods were with us. The piano tuner was finished, the studio was available, and I said, we'll be right over. Mr. Levant said, would you drive me over? I'm a little nervous. I said, sure. So we're driving down Sunset Boulevard, and he said, you don't remember me, do you? I said, I certainly do. He said, where do you know me from? I said, when I was a band leader in the Moulin Rouge, you were a piano player plugging songs for Remick. And as a matter of fact, I recorded one of your tunes on Vocalion Records. He says, that's right. I didn't think you'd remember me. He said, I certainly know who you are. And we had a nice, friendly chat, but I'm burning, inside for what he's trying to do to me. He finally said, and how do you like it here? I said, I don't like it, and I'm not staying. Why not? I said, we're not running this show. The artists are running this company. I said, you're all a bunch of spoiled so-and-sos, and I'm not going to have any part of it. And he said, don't you leave Hollywood. We need men like you around here, and, oh, you should have heard him. Well, anyway, the recordings went off beautifully. I even turned pages for him. And the next quarrel we had was when our very dear friend, the late Buddy Clark, passed away in this airplane accident. It was my job to invite our Columbia artist to attend funeral services, and I happened to call him to attend the funeral, and he must have had a very bad night, and he yelled at me for waking him up to invite him to such a stupid thing as a funeral, and I haven't seen or talked to him ever since. There are many such stories. A story about Frank Sinatra when he tried to change a lyric of Cole Porter's and said that Cole Porter should have written it his way. Well, that's a long story, which perhaps I'll have an opportunity to tell you. But it's been a marvelous career. I left Columbia in 1950 and went to work as general manager for the Southern Music Publishing Company when Mitch Miller took over. And I would advise all A&R men that it would make a better A&R man out of them if they spent a couple of years as a music publisher. They'd know what the other side looks like, and I think it was a great help to me, I know, because after working for Southern for 2 years, I went with Manny to RCA, where I took over the Thesaurus Library Service and took over the programming and A&R work for Camden Records. And then I took over the Reader's Digest program and traveled all through Europe producing some of these things. And I do feel that being in the publishing business was a great help. Interestingly enough, and John Hammond can tell you a little bit more about this, he attended my farewell dinner. At the age of 65, RCA gave me a fabulous send-off at the St. Moritz Hotel, and it was there that I was tapped on the shoulder by 2 executives of the 3M company with whom I had been doing business in behalf of RCA, and they insisted that I was much too young and active to retire, as a result of which I was given a job as a musical consultant for the 3M company. It's been 2.5 years now since this has happened. during which time we have been working with Columbia Records uh, by using some of your masters on our 3M cartridge tape. And I can say this for the record, that although we have deals with Mercury, Philips, Vanguard, Westminster, Command, so many labels, that my personal relationship with Columbia has just been wonderful. The people at Columbia Records have been most cooperative, and every time I walk into the Columbia office, I feel that perhaps I'm still working here. It's real home. And the thrill that I got just a couple of hours ago when I walked into this magnificent new building, to think that this is Columbia Broadcasting System, which incidentally I personally could have bought back in 1928 with a lot less money than I made last year, believe it or not. Anyway, it's been grand talking to you. I hope that you've enjoyed hearing it. Any of you boys who would like to talk to me personally, I'm at your service. I'm only a couple of blocks away. Bruce Lundvall can tell you where that is, because, as you can probably tell by all this jabber, I just love reminiscing. God bless you. Last year, I made several TV appearances for 3M, where I put a show on showing the history of the recording business. I had with me an old-fashioned phonograph with the old tin horn, and I had other instruments, and of course, last but not least, our new 3M cartridge tape. In these interviews, I would be asked by the interviewer, who are some of the men who were in your various orchestras? And I would say, well, rather than tell you about it, let me show you some canceled checks that I carry with me. These are men who have worked with me and to whom I paid various amounts for recording sessions. I would show them a check to Benny Goodman for $25 when he recorded for me for Columbia in 1932 and 33. I showed him canceled checks of Tommy Dorsey and Jimmy Dorsey. But the one that I prided mostly was one that I had given to a young violinist who was playing at the Capitol Theater and who was a member of the orchestra. And I would introduce it in the following manner. I would say, here's a check, ladies and gentlemen, that I want you to see, and I would get a close-up on television. And it's made out to Eugene Ormandy. It was dated February 1924. And then I would say, little did I dream that after all these years, I would be in position not only to show you this check, but to play for you on our 3M cartridge tape Mr. Ormandy's latest recording. Now let's hear him as he conducts the Philadelphia Orchestra in such and such and such a piece. I'd press the button and, of course, get a marvelous demonstration of the work. And while that was going on, the public would see this canceled check made to Eugene Ormandy, who incidentally got $1 more than the rest. He got $26. It's like the opportunity sometimes of showing you this canceled check.
I thought it was my day, you know. I was out in the street screaming and carrying on. Instead, we come into this filthy basement and risk our lives. The reason I stay on here so long is I dread going back to that dressing room. If you think this is bad, that is worse. It leaks. I have no idea what is upstairs. But whatever is up there, somebody pulled the plug out. I love you all. See you again soon. Good night.
This is the humor of Miss Phyllis Diller, a very, very funny lady. And upcoming next, Phyllis Diller's opinion of what she calls tightwad airlines. When you go out of your office, does your telephone go out too? If your telephone calls are important to you, you should have a telephone that automatically answers itself in your voice. The RSVP secretary transforms your telephone into a personal 24-hour electronic message center. It's called RSVP because it actually records, sends, and verifies home messages. And you can receive those messages wherever you are and when you telephone your own telephone. The RSVP secretary is voice activated. It places no limit on the length of your important incoming calls or telephone orders. And with RSVP's tiny trigger in your pocket, you can actually change the message you leave for your callers by remote control. What does RSVP cost? Less per month than an answering service, and once you pay for it, it costs you nothing. So call now for a 15-minute, no-obligation demonstration in your office or home. The number to call is 870-4777, 870-4777. And your call will be answered by an RSVP secretary. Call now, 870-4777.